Alright, good afternoon or good evening. I'm not doing the video cam, but so if you're listening to today's lecture, you'll get a lot of great information. If not, you could choose to read the chapter in the book, whatever you think works best for you. But at first, this lecture is going to seem a little off topic, but it's not. I am going to start off talking about the Europeans a bit and looking at their role in Asian trade. And when you look at your essay question at the end of the textbook, in fact, the question is going to ask you guys to compare how do the Chinese and the Japanese respond to Christianity. So it's all related in our AP World class. So we are covering our last topic of the early modern era. So the Asian Sea Trading Network, the 16th century Asian Sea Trading Network stretched from the Middle East to Africa to East Asia. So pretty much this is what we used to call the Indian Ocean Trade Network, but the name just simply implies that there became this more dominant Asian influence. So you may want to take note of some of the goods traded through the Arab zone. You had glass. You do not know glass is made from heating sand, so it made sense that that was a trade product. Carpets, tapestries, horses, slaves, gold, ivory. Through the Indian zone, like the Indian Ocean, India still was a large producer of cotton, and cinnamon and other spices were really important in Indian trade, as well as salt. And then the Chinese zone, you had additional spices, silver, paper, porcelain, and silk. Most trading was done along safe coastal routes. Major intersections or choke points or openings at the Red Sea, Persian Gulf, Straits of Malacca. So we'll look at a map on the next slide. Europeans initially attempted to dominate trade as they rose in sea power. They saw a window of opportunity because it seemed to be that there was no central control, and that means there was not one civilization that controlled these trade routes. They were utilized by everyone, and they felt that there was also a window of opportunity because there was no military force routinely patrolling these trade routes. Some additional notes: a choke point is basically a geographical feature which forces a group to pass through a narrow space, thus decreasing power. European involvement in Asia focused on efforts to find profitable ways to carry Asian products to Europe. So remember, especially China still had those highly desirable luxury goods at this time period. And Indian Ocean traders were only lightly armed against pirates. That kind of gets to that last point there where it was not policed. So looking at the slide, oh, there you go, I was trying to find my cursor. We have our various trade cities, but if you look at where these little red arrows are, that's what we refer to as choke points. And the map here does a good job of kind of showing you where do various products come from. So the Portuguese trading empire, so to remind you from before the semester, the Portuguese trading empire was trade cities. Portugal is not a large country to begin with to colonize in large numbers. The Portuguese took what they could not get through fair trade by force. So if a group was not willing to trade with them, well, then they tried to impose military force. They found their goods were largely undesired by Asians, so that was a point of frustration. And we talked about that Asians didn't have a high demand for European-made goods. They will win supremacy on the African Swahili city-states and the Indian coast. They will not create supremacy along Chinese coast. 1507 to 1511, Portuguese built fortresses on a number of strategic points. So remember, this is our key term for this, is a trading post empire. Ultimately, Asian and Muslim networks are so strong that Europeans realize that they can't dominate it. Instead, they have to participate. So instead of dominating it, they're now another player in the trade that existed there. So the rise of the Dutch and English trading empires. So again, a little bit of review from the end of last semester. But the Portuguese did not have the soldiers or the ships to maintain monopolies indefinitely. So a monopoly means to have complete control. Many traders ended up trading independently, and there was a rampant corruption among traders as well. So it was pretty much impossible for one country to really control these trade networks. The Dutch and the British challenged the Portuguese empires. It weakened. By 1620, the Dutch overtook Malacca. So you may remember, if you look at a map, that's in Indonesia. And they built a port at Batavia on the island of Java. The Dutch focused their energies into controlling spices, And they used a peaceful means to enter the Asian market as opposed to forceful like the Portuguese. Some other side notes that you don't necessarily see on the slide here. The Portuguese are also focusing on new world economies, so that's part of the reason why they'll start to weaken in Asia, because they're focusing on their colonies in Brazil. They will try to inflict severe punishments for rival traders or traders that betrayed their loyalties, such as cutting off hands. So they were very brutal, and if you remember when I introduced slavery, I also said the Portuguese were responsible for establishing that really harsh treatment of slaves as well. So the Dutch and the British were able to challenge the Portuguese as their influence weakened in Asia. The Dutch were also able to sustain what becomes known as the Dutch Golden Age because of the trade that they peacefully established that created more effective trade. One exception, however, for the Dutch, if you look at that last bullet point, is down here, is that the Dutch, they generally use peaceful means to enter the Asian market. One exception is that they were allowed to have contact with the Chinese and the Japanese. And so one of the things that we're going to look at when we focus more on the Ming and Japan, while they start to isolate themselves from Europeans, because the Dutch were more peaceful in their approach, the Dutch will be one European group that the Chinese and the Japanese remain in contact with by choice. So the European tribute systems in Asia. Europeans can control much of the sea trade networks and coast, but they could not dominate the inland territories. And so this would be part of the reason why they never completely dominate the region. Asian armies were able to resist Europeans. So even though we're going to start to see this turn of influence as we start period 4 with essentially the rise of Europe, Europeans never conquer Asia. They never colonize, when I say Asia, but more specifically China or Japan, like they will do with Africa and other territories. So Europeans often had to accept the power of Asian rulers in order to receive permission to trade. And the reason why they had such resistance, it wasn't, remember Europeans had guns. It's not going to be a technology issue, it's just going to be the vast number of soldiers that China has that they're able to resist. Europeans are going to establish tribute regimes, much like the Spanish imposed on Native Americans in the Americas. Indigenous peoples lived under their own rulers, but paid tribute and products as they worked in coerced labor systems. And this is going to be a very common approach or consistent approach in India, for example, where Indians are going to be allowed to maintain local control, but they're going to be expected to pay in terms of goods to European leaders. Again, some additional side notes you may not see here. Europeans were also apprehensive about moving in on land. There's the issue of intermarrying and culture. Europeans realized that just like African trade, they must work with the existing system. The Dutch will arrive on the island of Java for the coffee trade, and so those are just again some side notes of Europeans' approach to trade in Asia. So missionary efforts, and so this is going to tie into your essay prompt. And so you can easily go and look in the textbook and through this slide to gather evidence that you can use for your essay next Tuesday. But missionary efforts in South and Southeast Asia. So Catholic Portuguese and the Spanish tried to convert parts of Asia. For the most part, they're highly unsuccessful. They will send over missionaries that were a mix of Franciscans, Dominicans, and Jesuit groups. These are all Catholic missionaries. India seemed to be the most promising for religious conversion. In the 1660s, Jesuit Robert de Nobili studied Sanskrit and Indian culture. So he's going to initially appeal to those low caste Indians, which makes sense. They're the most underrepresented under the Hindu system. Ultimately, though, high caste groups refused to give up traditional beliefs and obviously their social position. Conversion occurred only in isolated areas like the northern Philippines. And then down the road, when the Philippines, really do become a substantial Spanish colony, even today, many Filipinos happen to be Catholic. So in the Philippines, what you see is a blend of traditional beliefs with Catholicism. Again, some additional side notes that you don't see in the slide there. The Dutch and the English are Protestant. There is not the same interest in conversion in Protestantism as there was in Catholicism. So you will not see like British Anglican missionaries going into Asia. Islam also had arrived much earlier, and while there are some Muslim converts in China, for example, our traveler, Zheng He, was actually a Muslim. Again, you know, there's just not really much of a demand for Christianity in a society or empire like China, because Confucianism is just so grounded. Christians dreamed of a Christian Asia that would unite with a Christian Europe against the Muslim world, but that never happens. And again, a large part of that is China and Japan felt culturally superior to Christian beliefs. So again, there just was not this desirability factor to convert. So looking at the Ming Dynasty. So Ming China lasted from 1368 to 1644. It was founded by Zhu Xuanzang, a military commander of peasant origins. And so while the Mongols started to weaken, they had many peasant revolts. And so he alternated between a life of begging and living in a monastery to survive. So again, a very humble origins. By the 1340s, Zhu left the monastery to join a rebellion against the Mongols. He was given small armies to run. His armies overthrew the Mongols and took back most of China. By 1368, Zhu declared himself Hongwu Emperor, and he returned China to Chinese imperial traditions, and he removed all Mongol influences. And so he is the first emperor of the Ming Dynasty. To give you some examples of traditions he brought back, it was Confucianism, the civil service system, bureaucrats, also other cultural traditions like Chinese-style clothing, expelling all Mongol names, so going back to strictly Chinese names, and Chinese architecture returned as well. So there you go, you have a map kind of looking at the extensiveness of the Ming Dynasty after the Mongols were expelled. So we have our scholar gentry revival, another one. So Hongwu realized the scholar gentry system was necessary to revive Chinese civilization. Confucian-based examination system was reinstated after the Mongols and made more complex. The textbook spends about 2 paragraphs explaining this pretty well, but this was a really intense examination. Sometimes, you know, young people felt ill while they're taking it, and you know, they weren't taken care of. Their health was not the primary concern, but it was very extensive. The exams took several days to complete. In fact, you know, these young individuals that spent time studying, you know, they had to travel far distances to the examination centers. They were basically put in a room that was similar to like a jail cell. They were allowed like 1 bag of like personal goods, and they were expected to hammer out this test. So if you think the AP exam sounds hard, you could be taking a civil service exam. Those who passed were eligible to take more exams given every 3 years. So they would take even more rigorous exams to reach higher levels of government positions. Test takers competed for degrees and then for positions in the bureaucracy. Women still could not take the exam, and imperial academies and regional colleges were restored. So the one thing this does bring credit to is they're not just reinstating Chinese Confucian culture and the government system, but they're also now, again, creating a desire for higher learning. Some additional notes on this. Scholar candidates were held in large compounds surrounded by walls and a watchtower. So they were heavily guarded to make sure there was no cheating. Each candidate was given a cubicle to eat, sleep, and answer questions. They were not allowed to leave. 4,000 candidates competed for about 150 degrees, so that shows you how competitive it was. And this is also going to help create that surge in the belief of Chinese cultural superiority, because the examination system was so rigorous. So the belief that they had a superior education model, say, compared to other areas such as Europe. Hongwu is going to instate political reforms. Neo-Confucians, so remember, Neo-Confucianism was established under the Tang and Song dynasty. It was to revive Confucianism, but it also adopted some Buddhist and Taoist elements to try to stop people from following those faiths as opposed to the philosophy of Confucianism. And so Neo-Confucianism, Confucians were also suppressed under Mongol rule. So this is a real resurgence for them now that the Mongols are expelled. So they're going to increase their influence, and they're going to support obedience to the state. So again, those hierarchical relationships that are important to the Confucian philosophy. Hongwu sought to limit influence of administrators. He abolished the position of a chief minister. Documents that were a threat were censored as sanctioned by Hongwu. So again, that's strict consolidated power that is designed to put more authority in the hands of the actual emperor as opposed to his ministers or advisors. Public beatings were given to those bureaucrats found guilty of corruption or incompetence. Hongwu declared that the emperor's wives should only come from humble family origins and limited the number of eunuchs. Potential rivals were exiled to estates in the provinces. Some additional side notes, Hongwu was concerned about bureaucracy becoming too powerful. He transferred most powers to himself. He impressed honesty, virtue, and loyalty. He intended to end court factionalism. So remember, court is where landed aristocrats and bureaucrats would gather around the emperor and in the court city. But as it's very common with court politics, you have groups, so kind of think of factions similar to like political parties. And so he wants to end court factionalism by declaring that emperors' wives can only come from humble origins. What this means is it minimizes the power plays that were happening, like say in Europe, by high-ranking families and cliques. So he's basically trying to get rid of any possibility for a power play to be worked against him, or any kind of like rebellion. Potential rivals were exiled to prevent plots against rulers or fights over succession, so who would follow him. So Neo-Confucian social dominance. Hongwu introduced measures that would improve life for peasants. Public works projects, opening of new lands, lowering forced labor demands, promoting handcraft industries. So these were all things to improve the lives of peasants. Rural landlords allied themselves with bureaucrats. Peasants often became tenants of landlords. So there was this increasing growing gap between the wealthy and the poor. Women continued to be subordinate to men. Social status of elite women, they tried to manipulate power through husbands and sons. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. Social status of non-elite women was grim, and they were expected to bear sons. And so you start to see, really see the beginning of this a strong bias towards having male sons as opposed to female daughters when they're born. Some additional side notes: unoccupied lands belong to those who cultivated them. This encouraged westward expansion. So, peasants desired to move west and land was uncultivated. The assumption there is that they could turn that into their own farmland. So that would encourage people to spread from other overcrowded regions. So an age of growth, agriculture, population, and commerce. Population increased during the Ming Dynasty and commercialization expanded. New crops were introduced, such as corn, sweet potatoes, and peanuts. So this goes back to our Columbian exchange. These are new crops that are being introduced from the New World because of European exploration. So if you look at the numbers there, population growth was quite significant. From the 14th century, 80 million people, to the 1800s, you had 300 million. China had industries that were in high demand, such as silk, tea, fine ceramics, usually called porcelain, and terms of trade were in China's favor. Merchants reaped huge profits. Zheng He's expeditions are going to bring Chinese goods across the Indian Ocean, and Chinese silver is going to dramatically increase. The fine arts will flourish during this time. Painters, literature, availability of books with woodblock printing is going to increase. Some additional side notes. China will receive more silver than any other single society at this time. So because their goods were so desirable, this put a demand on people such as the Portuguese and the Spanish to mine for silver so that they could trade with the Chinese. So the arrival of Europeans. So initially they want a policy of isolation and Neo-Confucians. By 1390, the first imperial edict issued to limit Chinese overseas commerce. And by 1433, you see the end of Zheng He's expeditions, and the Chinese Navy will decline. So we saw that in today's activity, that there was this growing concern of, does China need to have outside interactions, and the cost of the expeditions themselves. Europeans are drawn to what they think is a weakened China. So in the 16th century, you start to see Jesuit missionaries such as Matteo Ricci, Adam Schall. They're going to target emperors and chief advisors using scientific knowledge and technical skills to convert the elite. So they recognize that China already had a cultural bias towards being attracted to new innovations and gadgets. And so they're going to try to use it as an opportunity to win over Chinese converts. They gain few converts in the end. They'll be impressed by some of the European, innovations they bring, such as clocks, but for the most part, they're not going to gain converts. They're going to be considered barbarians and threats to Chinese Confucian culture. Franciscans and Dominicans tried to convert the masses, but it will not work. Some additional side notes. By 1390, limit size and number of Chinese overseas commerce. So that's kind of like that bullet point right up here that I mentioned. 1433 ended because of xenophobic fears and too much money. So again, xenophobic means being fearful of outside cultures. Things that Jesuits, so kind of going back down to here, things that Jesuits brought to try to attract the attention of possible Chinese converts. They came in and corrected faulty calendars. They brought in cannons. They brought in more advanced clockwork. And they tried to implement top-down conversion methods. So, what we usually see is the poor, weak, or abused, like the lower rungs of society, tend to convert first. But they realize, because of the long-standing Confucian culture, to look up for answers and respect. When I say up the social ladder, they're going to try to attempt to convert the elite, kind of, hoping for a trickle-down effect, but it does not work. So Ming declined. By the late 1500s, the Ming Dynasty was in decline. So after Hongwu, later Ming emperors are actually going to rely on eunuchs, and so that's going to be a factor that leads to the decline, because what ends up happening is some emperors become corrupt, or they kind of become hands-off with the government. They're living lavishly in the capital city known as the Forbidden City, where some of them never even leave their palace in their lifetimes, and they're going to leave a lot of the government decision-making to eunuch and advisors. So that's gonna, that mediocrity and that incompetent rulership, inferior or corrupt bureaucrats, that's going to weaken the government. Public works projects will start to fail. People will not be paid. We'll have famine. So due to the starvation, you're going to start to have peasant rebellions, and many peasants were abused by the landlords. In 1644, northern nomads are going to invade, known as Manchus. They're going to ally with those mistreated peasants. So they're going to overthrow the Ming Dynasty, and they're actually going to create the Qing Dynasty. But they understand China's and the subjects' desire to maintain Chinese culture, so they will adopt a Chinese name and name their dynasty the Qing Dynasty. So it's kind of interesting that they're going to be foreign rulers over Chinese subjects, but they're going to merge with Chinese culture. Some additional side notes that you don't necessarily see on this slide. Public work projects declined in frequency, so there weren't enough projects to maintain employment to help out the masses, the number of people there were. Maintenance of the dams, dikes, irrigation systems were often neglected, so that's also going to lead to agricultural issues such as famine. And nomads were attacking the Great Wall. And it's interesting because it's really under the Ming Dynasty that the Great Wall of China becomes what it is, what most people know it for. It's the Ming Dynasty that essentially finished building the wall. They fortify the wall. Their main concern was trying to keep out the Mongols from coming back in. The palace will be invaded. The Manchu tried to kill the family to end their line, and they leave a note indicating his feelings of disgrace. And so essentially that's part of how the Manchus are able to overthrow the Ming Dynasty. So now we're going to look at, and we haven't talked about Japan too much, but Japan, is now like at a turning point where they're going to be a major player for the rest of the school year in our class. So looking at Japan. So we've looked at Japan a bit, and we know that they were feudalistic, much like the Europeans. And they had different names for their feudalism. So instead of a lord, you had a daimyo. Instead of a knight, you had a samurai. But they were feudalistic. So basically you had large landowning aristocratic daimyo instead of lords. that had lots of peasants on their land and samurai warriors, and you had this system where shoguns relied on the loyalty of those daimyo. And so they were not very well centralized. The emperor, for the most part, was a religious and symbolic symbol. So usually it was whoever was the strongest military leader, known as a shogun, tended to rule over a large area. But once again, he had to rely on the loyalty of those daimyo. So they weren't very unified. There was often periods of chaos in Japan. So what we're looking at here, this turning point in period 4, is how does Japan start to become more stable and centralized? And we're going to look at a huge, Japanese woodblock art on Thursday. But by the 16th century, after a recurring civil war and the decline of the Ashikaga shogunate, Japan needed to restore unity. By 1573, Nobunaga, a daimyo, ends the Ashikaga shogunate through extensive use of firearms. So with that extensive use of firearms is because they had contacts with Western Europeans. Nobunaga unified much of central Honshu and drove armies against the Western daimyo. By 1582, he was killed before the completion of all of his conquests, but he did set events into motion. Toyotomi Hideyoshi, Nobunaga's general, continued Nobunaga's military campaign, and he will establish rule of China by 1590. Hideyoshi launched unsuccessful attacks on Korea, so he did try to expand beyond the Japanese island. 1598 he will die, and a struggle will ensue for succession of who's going to rule after him. A few side notes that aren't necessarily here. As I mentioned, Nobunaga obtained his firearms from the Portuguese traders. And looking back down here, Hideyoshi also had long-term goals of trying to control China and India, but clearly he did not make it that far. So looking at this map here, you see the reunification of Japan by Nobunaga and Hideyoshi. So now we're going to look at the Tokugawa shogunate, and this is really where that strong centralized power is established and who we're going to focus on Thursday. So the Tokugawa shogunate, Ieyasu, and again, I'm probably not pronouncing that correctly, he's going to win the contest for succession after Hideyoshi's death. By 1603, the emperor appoints him shogun. Ieyasu did not continue Hideyoshi's military campaigns outside of Japan, so lesson learned, but instead focused on consolidating his power at home, and instead focused on creating stability within just Japan, the island of Japan itself, the mainland and the immediately surrounding islands. He reorganized remaining daimyos. So this is kind of a similar theme. When we had kings in Europe start to consolidate power, they had to start to check how much power the lords had. And one of the ways that Europeans did it, as a review, remember, as merchants and trade increased, kings were able to start to generate tax revenue, and with that tax revenue they could create their own standing armies, so they didn't necessarily have to require the loyalty of lords. And so this is kind of the same conundrum that the Tokugawa shogunate is confronted with, is how do they shift power away from those rich lords, the daimyos, and shift the power into their hands and consolidate and control Japan. So most land in central Honshu is now under the control of the Tokugawa family rather than under daimyo control. And we'll talk about Thursday a bit more how he reorganizes those lords to his benefit. He will rule from Edo, so he'll shift the capital to Edo, and that is what is now known as Tokyo. Tokugawa's victory put an end to civil wars and brought political unity and centralization to Japan. So Tokugawa, kind of that shogunate, really gets that credit for completely ending the civil wars and establishing centralized power in Japan. So Japan and the European challenge. European traders began visiting the islands in increasing numbers since 1543, when the Portuguese were shipwrecked on the Japanese coast. European traders and missionaries brought firearms, printing presses, and other Western devices such as clocks, trade for Japanese silver, copper, and art. Firearms will dramatically affect Japanese warfare. This is what will shift them from feudalism to modernity. And the introduction of guns is also going to basically end the samurai class, and there's going to be a lot of resentment from samurais as there's this transition in structure, because they were a warrior class that are now going to lose their prominence because of the change in weaponry. Roman Catholic missionaries arrive in Japan as well to try to convert the Japanese to Roman Catholicism. By the 1580s, there were actually thousands of Catholic converts. At first, Catholics are protected from Buddhists by Nobunaga, because remember, Japan was the majority become Buddhist by this point. Their native religion was Shintoism, but through China, during the post-classical era, Buddhism did arrive in Japan, and many had converted to Buddhism. Christianity is ultimately viewed by the Tokugawas as a threat to their authority. So about halfway through the Tokugawa shogunate, they start to see this as an outside influence and threat to their culture. Christian missionaries will be ordered to leave. Japanese that converted are going to be forced to revert back to Buddhism. In some cases, people will be killed. So this is going to be a pretty, violent reaction, and, kind of a 180. Again, additional side notes that aren't necessarily visible right here. The Japanese will begin to kind of reverse engineer the firearms, so they'll start to produce their own firearms and improve them to their fighting style. Christians also tried to adopt top-down conversion for Catholicism. So just like in China, they tried to convert the elites. So that way it would have some kind of trickle-down effect. Militant Buddhists dislike Catholics, and they also dislike Nobunaga. So they're loyal to the emperor and traditional style of rule. So they, traditional Buddhists didn't really feel necessarily loyal to the shogunate itself. Nobunaga didn't like Buddhism, tensions in Japan between Buddhism and state power, and they believed Christianity would weaken Buddhism. So there was also a larger concern of whether or not these Christian missionaries had a larger power or intention as their goals in infiltrating Japanese society. And as I said, Japanese converts are going to be forced to renounce their faith. Those who did not could be tortured and executed. So Japan's going to enter a period of self-imposed isolation, much like the Ming Dynasty starts to enter once they cut off Genghis explorations. Japan was worried about European conquest and any measures they were taking to so they started to take measures to restrict foreign activities in Japan. So you kind of have a timeline showing how the Japanese increasingly isolated themselves from European contact. In the 1590s, Hideyoshi ordered Christian missionaries to leave Japan. Japanese Christians were persecuted. 1614, Christianity was banned by Ieyasu. So that was the first Tokugawa shogunate. So just to help you follow along, this transition of whether or not Christianity was accepted or banned goes all the way back to the beginning of this Japanese section. So it preceded the Tokugawa shogunate. 1616, foreign traders were confined to a few cities. 1630, all Japanese ships were forbidden to trade or sail overseas. So not only did they not want to allow Europeans into Japan, they also started to forbid the Japanese from sailing themselves and having exposure to other groups. By 1640, Tsushima was the only island where trade could occur, and they only allowed the Dutch and the Chinese to enter. They were smart enough to recognize that if they wanted to know what was going on abroad, they still had to maintain some contacts with foreign groups. By the mid-17th century, Japan's isolation was almost totally complete. Western books would be banned. By the mid-18th century, the School of National Learning established based upon indigenous culture. And so you have a revival of Neo-Confucian philosophy, which was now embraced. So a few additional side notes. Contact with the Dutch was allowed. This allowed Japanese to stay informed about Western developments and adopt certain tactics. The Japanese also put an emphasis on the School of National Learning. So this was Japan's unique historical experience. Neo-Confucians argued for a focus inward, so being isolationist inward, and they're pretty much following China's example by self-imposed isolation. This is key to point out. You really want to review that Quizlet as well. Look up at some of the key terms in the book. Everything in the book is in the Quizlet. But part of that new national Japanese learning, There's also some other things that are mentioned, such as this is a time of Japanese art and culture flourishing, kabuki theater with like these really unique masks are created, Japanese literature starts to flourish, and so those are some things to look at as well. All right, well, I hope you have a good evening.